morning. Uh, if you've not met me, my name is Leland. I'm the children's pastor here. Robbie's on vacation this morning, so you guys are stuck with me. It's always a joy to get to give the message, but before we get into that, I do have a real quick announcement. We do have a drop in the bucket today. Drop in the bucket is a little initiative that we do as a church just for when we see a need arise in our personal community. People can basically submit what's going on, and as a church, we can just take a special offering to try to better love that person, individual, couple, whatever it is. And today we have one. So there is a couple in our church that knows another couple that recently went to the hospital to give birth, to have a baby, and they ended up having a stillborn birth. They have a GoFundMe that they're trying to raise $4,000 for the funeral, and they've raised about $1,000 of that. So today our goal is to raise about $3,000. Anything that comes over that extra, we'll just give to them as a love offering. You can give in the back. There's a regular dish for the offering that Van just informed us about. Then there's also a bucket that says drop in the bucket that you can put cash in there. If you put any checks in there on the memo line, go ahead and write drop in the bucket so it doesn't get mixed up with any of the regular offering. And then the same link that Van pointed out earlier, you can give online until the end of tonight. So, moving into the message, we've been in a series called How to Neighbor. So we've been essentially looking at what it means as Christians who are trying to faithfully follow Jesus to fulfill the second greatest commandment, to love our neighbors as ourselves. But there's like an additional aspect that we've been looking at of Jesus, and the parable of the Good Samaritan teaches us that everyone's our neighbor. And when we hear that everyone's our neighbor, sometimes that can be like an intimidating thing, because it's like I've got to like constantly be like ready to like love everybody at every time and share Jesus at every single moment. So we've been walking through this practice that helps us to like love our neighbor at an elementary level. Like, what if Jesus wants us to love like our actual neighbors? So we've been walking through this practice called bless. It's an acrostic that stands for multiple ways that we can bless our neighbors. And the really cool thing about it is it kind of makes it to where it's not quite so burdensome on us. And also, they're a lot more receptive on it because we're coming at it with great intentions and to build relationships and to truly love people like Jesus would intend for us to. So the acrostic begins with B. A few weeks ago, Ben taught on that. It's begin with prayer. It's the idea that before we go to build relationships with people, and well before we even consider sharing Jesus with them, that we would be praying for our neighbors. That we would be praying that God would bring people into our life that we can bless. And the second letter is L, which is listen. And that's the idea that very often when we come to conversations with people, we kind of like they're talking, but like our listening is us thinking about what we're going to say next. So it's the idea that when people are talking to us and when they're sharing their life, whether that be joys or burdens, that we are authentically listening just as Christ did during his ministry on earth. The third letter is E, which is eat, and typically everybody's favorite one, is that we would bring people into our homes, that we would gather in other homes, that we would go out to coffee, go get dessert with people. We would share our lunch break with people because there's like this intimate, special bond that's built over tables. And then the fourth letter, which is today, is S, and that stands for serve. And as I was reflecting over various times in my life where I've seen people serve and it make impact and that it was really something cool, I kind of came to like two different scenarios. A couple weeks ago, Autumn and I were in the Joplin, Missouri, and Oklahoma area visiting some family and some friends. And she went to, it was like a 3 or 4 block drive, super short. She was going to drop me off at a friend's house so we could spend some time together and just kind of hang out for a while. And we came across the iconic one and only Children's Lemonade stand. And you can picture it. It's got the big canopy. So they've got a table, homemade sign. 2 kids are behind it. So I pull up and roll down the window and I say, hey, can I get a lemonade? And the boys are on their tablet, so they're not paying attention, so they like throw it to the side, and then they're like, yeah, we'll get that for you, we got it. And they're like running around real quick. They've got this sign that says like lemonades, but they're also selling limeades. They're each $2 because they're affected by inflation as well. So I ask them for a lemonade, and they're like going back and forth, getting everything ready, and then one of the boys said to the other one, and based on what he say, I can only assume that he's a brother. But he said, did you want a lemonade or a limeade? And the other boy looks at him and says, were you even listening? He said he wanted a lemonade. Get the man what he wants. And I'm like in my car, like trying not to like just be bursting out laughing. And they bring it up. I give them the $2 and a couple extra bucks because I remember how hard it was to like come by money when I was that young. And they hand me the cup, and I look in it, and it's got maybe 2 drinks of lemonade in it. So as I was driving away, I was reflecting on like, did I seriously just pay $4 for like a third of a cup of lemonade? And you probably know I'm not paying for the product as much as I'm paying that when you see people enter a neighborhood, and if they're engaging with it in absolutely any way that's positive, that there's just something beautiful about that. A second instance was last October when we were interviewing for this job, and obviously I'm up here today, so we took it. We were going through the phone calls, the Zoom calls, and we get to that last interview where it's like we gotta come over here, meet everybody, see the church, and make a decision. After we took the position, we had a 7-hour drive home. We get about 30 minutes through our drive, and the rear right tire of our car explodes. And I'm not saying that like it was flat, we had to patch it, and then we had to refill it and keep going. It was like the tread of our tire was all over the side of the highway, and the rim of our car was like almost sitting on like the side of the road. So I go to the back of the car to get the spare and start putting it on. And I realized a couple weeks ago, I was moving some stuff around from car to car, and I had thrown the spare from that car into my wife's car, and so now we don't have the spare. So we call our wonderful insurance company, and they say that they'll have somebody out. We've got like the roadside assistance, so in like 25 minutes they'll have somebody out. And about 45 minutes go by, and we still haven't even heard anything from them. So like we call them up, and they're like, "You're a valued customer. We care about you. Thanks for your money." And that they'll have somebody out as soon as they can. About another 45 minutes go by, and we haven't heard anything. Then in like another 20 minutes, and so I just call them off, and we call like the first tow truck company that we can Google online. They say they'll be there in like 20 minutes, and then they show up in 20 minutes. So they get us hooked up on the back of their truck, and they are Autumn, and this guy that is working at this company are all sitting on like the front bench, just kind of talking about different things. He's a pretty stereotypical guy, kind of what you would expect for a job like that, like kind of bigger, probably a stronger guy, big black beard, probably in like his late 30s, early 40s. So as we're just talking about all kinds of stuff, but then I call the local Walmart, because this is Sunday night at like 7 p.m., like it's the only place that's going to be able to get us a tire and get it fixed this late. They tell me they've got the tire, and they're willing to put it on, and so we drive over there, and when I get there, I buy the tire, and then they tell me that the mechanics decided to leave early. So now there's no mechanics. I have a tire, and I've pretty much given up, and I'm ready to call Robbie and be like, can you just get us a place to stay tonight? Like, we're just going to figure this out in the morning. And at that man, that, like I said, was pretty stereotypical, like, really had no reason to do this, said he's going to take us back to his shop, and he's going to put the tire on himself, and he's going to get us taken care of so we can get home tonight. There's something significant and something amazing about when you see somebody serve in a capacity like that. Like, I found myself thinking, like, what is going through this man's head that he would be willing to do something like this? And today we'll be in Mark 7, 31 through 37, where we get to see an instance where Jesus serves in a community in a similar way, and people have the same reaction. Sometimes with a text like this, it's kind of hard to like picture Jesus like this as service, because like he's just so grand and such a great Lord. But as we walk through it, you can really see how this text applies to how we could serve our neighbor in our communities. So again, that's Mark 7, 31. Beginning through the text, it says, "Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place a hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears, and then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh said to him, 'Ephphatha,' which means be opened. At this the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. 'He has done everything well,' they said. 'He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak.'" I would imagine when you were driving to church this morning, you did not have the expectation that we were going to be talking about putting fingers in people's ears, spitting and touching people's tongues. But nevertheless, that's where we're at this morning. Running through the first couple verses one more time. as we're walking through this. It says, "Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place a hand on him." So we see Jesus ends up in this area called the Decapolis. Deca meaning 10, and then the end of that word basically means cities. It's this area, it's like a major region where there are 10 like larger cities. And what we do know about this area is it was most likely, for the most part, mostly Gentiles, and there were probably Jews that were interdispersed in different areas, but it would have been a lot of people that not only were not familiar with Jesus' message, but were not familiar with like the message of Israel either. It's kind of a weird route that Jesus takes. So it says he goes from Tyre, then through Sidon, and then down the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. It'd be almost like if you wanted to go to Clarksville, and then you wanted to get to Nashville, but then you chose to like go to Clarksville, and then over to Memphis, and then like down the southern border of Tennessee, and then up into Nashville. So you ask yourself why Jesus would take such a strange route like this. It's likely because Jesus wants to go out of his way to include Gentiles in his mission. He's doing everything he can to include as many people as he can in the message that he's coming to bring, and to bless different places, and to we're focusing on this idea of being like a neighbor in like our communities. He's trying to be this great neighbor absolutely everywhere. We see it in Luke 17 where Jesus heals 10 lepers, and again another Gentile area. We see it in John 4 where Jesus and the Samaritan woman is one of the first people that he's ever shared that he is the Messiah. And another interesting thing is this actually isn't the first time that Jesus has been here. And last time Jesus was here, he did not exactly leave with 5-star glowing recommendations. He ended up healing a man who was possessed by multiple demons, and after doing this, the people in the community begged him to leave. So now we see in this text here that people are begging Jesus to do this great thing. And I want to take just a moment to really focus on the man that Jesus heals in this text. To really like kind of feel what it would have been like to be him, and to like put ourselves in his shoes. This man was, the text says that he was deaf and could hardly speak. We can probably assume that based on what the text says about how he could hardly talk, and that after Jesus heals him, he was able to speak and he knew the language, that he probably has not always been this way. There was probably some sort of injury, some sort of disease that brought him to where he's at in his life currently. So as we're thinking about him, I kind of want you to take a moment to think about what it would be like to be born not able to hear. What it would be like to grow up in a family where you consistently never got to hear the voices of your loved ones and people like that. Now imagine not being able to speak, to be able to hear people, and not be able to communicate what you want to communicate to them. And thirdly, imagine both of these together. To be so inhibited by being deaf and being partially mute that you essentially are not able to communicate in nearly any way. And then lastly, and of course this is an assumption we make on the text, imagine being able to do all this stuff and then losing that. The type of life that this man lived was probably kind of devastating. And he comes to Jesus at this point in an extremely, extremely tough place. And we look how Jesus responds to this. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, "Ephphatha," which means be opened. At this the man's ears were opened and his tongue was loosened and he began to speak plainly. So we see here the first thing that Jesus does is he takes him aside, which is interesting because multiple times in Jesus' ministry he seems to almost put people on display, when they have great faith for the sake of his ministry, the sake of his mission. But he doesn't do that here. A couple reasons why possibly Jesus isn't looking to be the center of attention here. He's not looking to self-promote. He's not looking to really see his ministry grow as huge here because he still has ministry that he wants to do here. And if he grows so big, he's not going to be able to do that. Another reason is Jesus recognizes how difficult this man's life has been, and he's not looking to put him as the center of attention either. He's not looking to make a 3-ring circus out of this man. Another thing about this section is I feel like we often get lost in the details of texts like this. We read things like, Jesus is spitting and putting fingers in his ears, and it's just kind of strange. Why would Jesus do all this stuff? But I think it's a good reminder to remember that there's about 2,000 years in between this and now. And a lot of this just boils down to symbolism. We see that Jesus puts his fingers in his ears and then takes them out as a symbol of this man's ears are closing, they have been closed, and they're now open. We see Jesus spitting and then touching his tongue because it's the symbol of his tongue is as stiff as it could possibly be. He's not able to speak. He can hardly talk. And it's this idea that it's so stiff, it's almost like locked, that Jesus is loosening it. Jesus is fixing it. The text almost seems to, like, in like the strict Greek, say that like the chain of his tongue was broken. And then the third symbol, and the most important, is that Jesus looks up to heaven. He wants this man to know exactly where this power, this miracle is coming from. And that's from our Heavenly Father. And after Jesus heals them, the text shares, Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. But the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Again, we see Jesus, likely because he's not wanting to see his ministry come to an end in this area yet, is asking them not to share about it. In the same gospel, in Mark 1, it shares at some point that he did something similar, commanded people not to say anything, and they said things anyway. And it made it to where Jesus was so bombarded with people that he had to move somewhere else to minister because he just couldn't get anything done because everybody wanted kind of a piece of his time. So at the end of this account, I feel like it's a good thing to ask ourselves one question. And that would be why? If you are new to the church, if you're a guest with us today, or even if you're a longtime Christian, you find yourself consistently asking questions about, like, is this all real? Like, what exactly does this matter to me? Like, is this something that I'm going to keep doing? I'd hope you'd ask yourself the question of, like, why would Jesus heal this man here? Jesus heals him, but doesn't, like, try to use him to, like, further his ministry, or doesn't use it to, like, become really big and so many people would use it, like, would know his name. And I think the answer to that question of why is because it's not that Jesus serves to, become so big and to be this really great guy and to be so powerful, but that Jesus serves out of his compassion. Our God is a compassionate God, and we consistently see him through the Gospels serving because of his compassion. In Mark 8, after he's been teaching to thousands of people for so long, and they're hungry enough that if they don't eat now, that they're likely going to collapse, Jesus says, I have compassion on these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance. Jesus' compassion is so big, he even feels it for people that are hungry, people that, necessarily, they're not like these beggars or these people that need this stuff, but people that are committed to Jesus' mission and following him. He has great compassion for them. Similarly, when Jesus teaches about the parable of the prodigal son, the text says, so he got up, and he, being the prodigal son, and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. We time and time again see Jesus sharing about his own compassion, but then again for the compassion of the Father. And it's even more amazing when we think about the type of people that Jesus has compassion on. Regardless of people's marital statuses, of how much money they have, of who they identify themselves with, of how they identify themselves, whether they're a mother, a father, a husband or wife, how much they care about their nation, how patriotic they are, God has compassion, Jesus has compassion on everybody. He has compassion on the individual. And speaking of the individual, he has compassion on the type of people that most of the world would just cast aside. On the sick and on the widow and on the poor and on children, on those who grieve. The gospel should not just appear as good news for those who are well off, those who are powerful, but for the marginalized, the disadvantaged, the outcasts, and sinners. And it's that looking at all the people that Jesus shows his compassion on, and because of that he serves, that we as a church respond with compassion like Jesus's. Jesus-like compassion should lead us to serve. But compassion can kind of be a tough conversation sometimes because I think we kind of get confused on how compassion actually works. Like, compassion's an emotion, it's a feeling, it's something that you experience in that way, but it's also a lot more than that. Like, you would never hear somebody say, like, I'm just not a very loving person. Like, yeah, love's a feeling, and loving could maybe even be like a personality trait, like that comes more naturally to you, but it would be wrong for you to say that, like, I'm not a loving person, so I just don't have to do that. And I think it's kind of the same way with compassion. Like, you're like, I'm just not a very compassionate person, so, like, I don't know, maybe serving's just not for me. And the University of California, Berkeley, did a study over compassion, and kind of a couple sentences, their main idea was that compassion literally means to suffer together. Among emotion researchers, it is defined as a feeling that arises when you are confronted with another person's suffering and feel motivated to relieve that suffering. So yeah, compassion starts here as like a feeling, an emotion, but like full compassion is nothing unless like it drives you to serve people, to suffer with people. And this is what Jesus knew as well. And unfortunately, I feel like as a church, of all the different areas in the blessed practice, this is one of the ones that we find ourselves failing the most. And I don't say that as like something to like condemn you guys, but I say this as somebody like I have multiple times and instances where I have felt the conviction to serve, and I've just like, it kind of excused my way out of it, like just came up with all these reasons why like maybe I'm not the best person to serve that person, and like, you know, maybe actually like a government program or like some sort of assistance would be better. Like maybe actually they've got like some good family members that like, or some good friends that would be able to help them with this, and like, you know, maybe I'm just not the right guy for this. And as I'm thinking about kind of all the excuses I've made in the past, I think there are actually like kind of a few that I see reoccurring. The first one is, I don't have anyone to serve. Like, you can't serve people if they're not there. And that's the great thing about this blessed practice that we're working through. Because it becomes, don't start with the first S. Start with the B. Begin with prayer. Pray that God would bring people into your life that you can serve. It begins with praying, and I assure you that if you do this, God is either going to bring you to people to serve, or he's going to bring people to you for you to serve. And then we move to like, you know, sometimes it's like, yeah, I know people to serve, but like, I don't really know them that well. And again, that's when it becomes to how great these blessed practices are. Because then we keep praying, and after we pray, we meet people. We don't feel as though we know them that well. Well, then that's when you gather. You listen to people. You get to know them. You be authentic, and you care about them. And you bring them into your homes. You gather in their homes, and you get to know people until times arise where you're able to ask them, like, hey, I see this need in your life. Is there any way that I can help you with that? Thirdly, and one that I think that we don't really like to share, but we often feel it, is like, I just don't want to. Like, there have been multiple times where it's like you go to serve somebody, and it's like, oh, man, I totally forgot I committed to this. And, like, you start kind of thinking about all the ways that, like, you can get out of it. And yeah, I know it's not fun waking up on a Saturday or Sunday morning to go hand out food to people or to serve in some capacity in the church, but I find myself every time that like I actually go and do it, I never leave there like, man, that was just terrible. I'm never doing that again. Like, I don't want to be any part of that anytime ever again. Typically it becomes, this was an incredibly rewarding thing. And we don't do it because it's rewarding, but we do it because it's great. It's like, it's so great to see compassion to come out into the world and for people to be served. Fourthly, and this is one that Robbie talked about last week, was like, I just don't have time. It's easier with eat, as Robbie said, because you have like 3 times a day maybe that you eat, and then you count in like breaks at work, and you've got like dessert and coffee trips and different things like that. It's really easy to add people into like your eating schedule. Harder with serving because that always comes out of your time. Nobody budgets serving time into their schedules, but I would ask you kind of like, what does your schedule look like? Because I can say for me, I've said this before, that I just don't have the time, but I reflect on the last month, and I know that I went golfing multiple times, went to multiple trivia nights, and lost desperately each time, went to multiple, like, played video games with people, board games with people, had numerous phone calls with my best friend about his new girlfriend, and I know that if I have time for that stuff, then there's probably a place that I can work in serving. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't rest and those things aren't good and there's not a place for that kind of stuff in your life, but there probably is a time that you can work in some serving. And sometimes people really do go through times where it's like there's something traumatic or something devastating going on where like your heart's probably not in it for serving. But I would ask that you might ask yourself if there's areas in your life at this current moment where you could kind of cut some time here and really kind of look for opportunities and to pray for opportunities to serve people. And lastly, and I think one of the most common ones would be like, what could I even do for them? Like, I'm the type of person that's like, I have like no trade skills. Like, I'm not going to be in your house fixing your plumbing. I'm not going to be like helping you fix a step on your porch. I'm not going to be like helping you install a bunch of stuff in your house. But it starts with small things. It starts with when you see a family that comes home with a new baby, and maybe it's their first one, cooking a meal for them. So they have one less thing to worry about. It's when you see the older lady across the street who her husband recently died, and she's working through all of that, and like her lawn's not mowed, or her leaves need raked, and there's an area that's where you can step up there. And sometimes it starts with a rake. One of the greatest stories that I've ever heard on serving and things like this is that our youth group kids this last week went on a trip called Christ and Youth Move. It's essentially like this 5-day conference camp type thing. It's something that I went to as a kid, and it's just an absolutely great thing. But on the 5th night, which was the last night of one of those trips, this guy named Jason French, he's actually the president of Christ and Youth, he told this story. Jason grew up in this house that was probably not typical, definitely not your typical like churched family. It seemed like his dad wasn't really in the picture very much. As a kid, like younger than like 5th grade, they'd have parties at their house where they'd invite like teenagers and stuff, and like Jason would be like mixing drinks for people, and it was definitely not the environment that a kid should probably be in. But there was also another time where his mom was kind of going out to bars and hanging out with people and doing things in her free time, that she met this guy, and then the next day, this guy and her showed up at Jason's house and said, "This is your stepdad now." No wedding, no talking to the kids first, just showed up and like, this guy's part of the family, he lives with us now. That was a huge change for Jason's life, but his life was pretty chaotic, so he kind of rolled with it. But his mom and this guy had an interesting conversation when they were at the bar. This guy said to her, if we get married, like we're talking about right now, we're going to do this family thing right. And that means we're going to start going to church, because churchgoers, like that's like the good families. So they pack up in their station wagon one time, and they start heading over to the church, and they get there, and Jason's stepdad's like, I don't think we're dressed right for this. And they leave, they go back home. They go again another time, and he pulls in, and Jason's stepdad's like, well, we are running a little late, we should probably go. They pull up a third time, and he doesn't say anything and just pulls out of the parking lot and goes home. But this 4th time, they head that way, and they go inside and have just this amazing time. That day, they had like ice cream for the kids, and they got to meet a whole bunch of people, and they really got to build relationships, and it was a wonderful thing. They kept going for a while, built tons of relationships, and it was just a great experience for them overall, but like they hadn't yet really like dove in and kind of bought into this whole Jesus thing all the way. And there was a time that Jason was kind of, you ever like as a kid, you would be like burning trash? Like you were like grew up in a family where like you didn't have a trash service, so you'd have to like burn it, and then that was like kind of one of your chores. So Jason was outside burning trash, and he goes inside to shower because it seems like everything's okay. His mom starts yelling for him. He like throws on his pants, no shirt, still dripping wet, runs outside, and you can see his entire lawn is on fire. Like, and I'm not talking like a small fire, like they're worried their entire property is going to burn down. He has this moment where he sees that like the fire's like underneath his brother's 55 Chevy, and it's going to ruin it. And what he didn't know is his mom had like a half-used can of hairspray in one of those bags and just shot flaming garbage all over their yard. So the mom realizes that one of the people from the church works close to where their stepdad worked. His stepdad's work didn't have a phone, and so he calls up the lady and says, like, in a panic, like, here's everything that's going on. Can you please get a hold of him? We really need him. Like, we're so worried. And there's like, of course, calls the stepdad, but before the stepdad can get there, she makes one more call. She calls the church, and then it just becomes like this: one person calls another person, and those two people call more people, and then all of a sudden, everybody in the church knows what's going on. And as the stepdad's pulling into the property, and he's like having to like dodge cars because cars are on the sides of the road, and when he gets to the house, he's got to park on the road because the parking lot's entirely full. And he like runs up to the house in a panic because he knows everything that's going on, and when he gets there, the fire's out. And that's because the lady from the church called as many people as she could, and everybody brought their rakes. Person by person slowly showed up, and just beat the fire down with rakes until it just wasn't there anymore. Saved their house, saved their stepdad's kind of work shed. And it's at this that we learn that serving leads people to Jesus. And then we can share. Because what happened after this was everybody left, and the very next weekend, Jason's stepdad went out to the creek with Jason, and they broke every single liquor bottle they had in the house. Jason's stepdad had just felt the conviction that I've not been following Jesus as Lord, and this is something getting in the way, so it's got to go. And that happened because of serving. Now, it brought forth this opportunity as they become to get more and more involved in the church. It makes it to where, like, people were able to actually share the message of Jesus with them because these people cared, because they saw that this church had compassion on them, and they felt led to serve, and it just made this great and wonderful relationship. And that's when we turn back to the text from today that we see in Jesus' account of these people. It says, Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Church, I would imagine you probably aren't the type of person that knows how to heal people's deafness and muteness and blindness and everything like that. But I bet you own a rake. And I bet next time the opportunity arises that you have the opportunity to serve somebody in a great way, it's going to be something that God's equipped you for. Because serving, compassionate Jesus-like serving, really does lead people to Jesus. And that's what we're going to talk about next week, is that when people feel that conviction, when they look at you, like I looked at that mechanic, and they're like, why are you the way that you are? Like, why do you care so much? You're not getting anything out of this. In fact, this is only taking things from you. It's there that we have the opportunity to share our story, that we can share what Jesus has done in our lives, that we can share what we've seen Jesus do in other people's lives, that we can share Jesus' story of the cross and the resurrection. And so that we pray. God, we pray that you would provide opportunities for us to bless, that you would remind us to pray, that we would take the initiative to pray, that we would listen to people, that we would gather with them, that we would eat with them, that we would feel convicted to serve. God, that you would help us in our struggles with compassion and our struggles with doing what's needed, and God, that you would encourage us and give us the power that we need to share our story, share other stories, share Jesus' story. God, I pray that blessing over our congregation today, and we are so thankful that we're able to gather because of Jesus. God, that you just through the cross and the resurrection, that all of this is possible and it wouldn't be otherwise. God, we pray as we're trying to learn what it means to be a neighbor at this elementary level, to just love our actual neighbors, that in our communities that we would feel the conviction to just step up and to be able to do all the things that you would wish that we would, so that your kingdom can grow. God, that people can know you and you can start to change lives. God, we ask all that in your Son's name. Amen.